Introducing a Codicon of Basketmaker Interpretive Rock Art Symbols by Rory Paul Tyler. The Basketmaker Indians lived primarily along the eastern and southern peripheries of the Colorado Plateau from 1000 BC to 1000 AD. They were prolific artists, and much of the best rock art in this region is of basketmaker origin. The Codicon document is named after a word I coined by combining codex and lexicon. These are two words for communications tools, but neither is in itself adequate for describing the character of basketmaker rock art, which is highly pictorial and representative, while at the same time being abstract and symbolic. The Codicon contains detailed interpretations of over 80 basketmaker rock art icons, along with 2 letter codes for each of these interpretations, design elements, and features. It describes how I arrived at these interpretations, what they may represent, primarily hunting intent, and how they interrelate. It covers over 350 screens. Other than astronomical interpretations, in which I am also deeply involved, the Codicon is the backbone of my interpretive work. This brief slideshow demonstrates how I created the Codicon and then used it as an interpretive tool. This is an early example of field notes recording a panel using the codes found in the Codicon. I used these diagrams to tell what glyphs are on this panel, what each may intend, and how they relate to each other. I can also do takeoffs and data analysis, how many of each style of glyph are here, and what each glyph is doing relative to other glyphs on the panel. Notes like this were transferred to charts and tables in the Codicon's companion document, Rock Art in the Mill Creek Game Drive Corridor, an interpretive exercise, referred to henceforth as Game Drive. There the codes were assigned values of 1 to 4 based on their level of activity in a hunting scenario. This allowed the creation of a sortable database which could be used as the mathematical foundation of an interpretive process. Like any scientific endeavor, this process can be tried, tested, and repeated. To my knowledge, nothing like this has existed before in the realm of rock art interpretation. However, because this is rock art, it is. At some point, interpretation is necessarily subjective. Consequently, parsimony was my ever-present muse and tormentor, she whom I admire and fear as befits the acolyte. Thus she demanded that the various aspects of the Codicon and Game Drive be constantly tested against each other as I simultaneously developed and refined the two. Now my only saving hope is that by chance my unavoidable blunders cancel each other out to an extent that keeps the statistical effort in some semblance of balance. Here is a photograph of the diagrammed panel. process that I used to create these interpretations relies essentially on a transmission of intent. First, I was lucky enough to find one common Basketmaker symbol that contained an irrefutable hunting intent. I then assumed that most nearby glyphs shared that or a related intent. Then I assumed that those glyphs retained that intent wherever I found them. I then assumed that most nearby glyphs shared that or a related intent. Then I assumed that those glyphs retained that intent when they appeared elsewhere, even if the originally interpreted glyph did not appear. Lastly, I assumed that other nearby glyphs on the new panel also shared that intent and transmitted related meanings to any other panel on which they might appear, and so on, and so on, and so on. I describe the steps in transmission of intent as primary interpretation, proximal transference, secondary transference, and secondary inference. As long as the pattern of the hypothesis remains parsimonious, the inferential chain remains viable. Logically, it's simple and intuitive. The recognition and use of related design elements arranged in plausible patterns, and the rigorous adaptation and application of parsimony are what set this interpretive system apart from others. By using these techniques, the system can be learned, taught, repeated, and perhaps applied elsewhere, maybe to other hunter-gatherer cultures. The design elements of the primary interpretation will differ from place to place, but if a primary interpretation is recognized and established, an inferential interpretive chain may be pursued. So, we must start by finding a primary interpretation, or it is what it is. There can be no question. The primary interpretive element in this system is a set of designs that create a distinct track, clearly associated with a short-eared, long-tailed animal. My default assumption for this icon's intent is predator, a cat or lion, although sometimes bear or bearcat may apply. The diagnostic elements of this track include a segmented foot, tined toes, and distinct claw marks. Tracks with these elements are common along the eastern and southern perimeters of the Colorado Plateau and would have been recognized anywhere in the Basketmaker territory of 1000 BC to 1000 AD. A common interpretation of this design is Ute bear track. While this may be true in some cases, it is generally far from the mark. I discuss why in the cat track and bear track entries of the Codicon. Not to put too fine a point on it, this icon frequently appears with Basketmaker addle designs. The addle throwing spear was abandoned in the region at least 700 years before the Ute people arrived. So, do the math. The next step in the transference of meaning is the proximal transference. You're known by the company you keep. This panel, at a critical juncture in a game drive corridor, contains at least 10 tined-toed predator tracks, indicating a high incidence of primary interpretation for this hunting intent. This suggests that by the principle of proximal transference, other glyphs on this panel could share that hunting intent. An important tactic in game drives is the ability to contain the prey. On this panel, the prey is being contained in 3 ways. The first is the Geological Formation, the crease and crack at the left. Geological formations are seldom identified as interpretive elements, but I have found them in common use as containment barriers such as parts of a corral or a drive line. A funneling effect, like the one seen here, is common. A second set of containment elements occurs on the right. Several figures are connected by lines or overlapped by lines, creating an impenetrable barrier for the sheep. While all the lines should be considered for containment intent, straight, wavy, zigzag, nested, spiral, dotted, handholders, etc., this does not mean that they are containment elements. The third set of containment elements occurs in the upper right part of the panel. At the top, a sheep balks as it approaches a folded over wavy line. I have identified this linear design as a bag. It serves the containment function of a corral or trap. Behind the sheep are 2 sets of sheep tracks. One set is going up and the other is going down, but they do not pass the linear containment elements at far right. I assume that they belong to the sheep that does not want to go into the bag. And here is a better look at the reluctant sheep, its confused tracks, and the bag which it appears loath to enter. The third step in this process I call secondary transference, or, to put it in a colloquial form, I know a guy who knows a guy. This panel is next to the previous image. It is at the narrowest part of the canyon. The linear elements probably indicate a containment or capture intent and or activity at the bottleneck. Another bag appears directly across the canyon, along with numerous other glyphs, including flute players and atlatl throwers. A Basketmaker figure on the left has ear bobs, a necklace, a belt, and a stippled body. The figure was probably painted, but the paint is gone. The bag icon is on the right. And here is the bag icon at center. Notice that it has trapped that sheep. Another bag on the left is almost deployed but not yet in use. The bag at right is fully deployed and has captured an animal. Its magical powers are on full display. A sheep is trapped inside the bag. The open end of the bag has split into 5 lines. Each line has a finely abraded split tip. The right side of the bag has acquired a head-like anthropomorphic characteristic, and the split tip is the guy who knows the guy. Each line ends in a finely etched split tip. It is this panel that drew my attention to the split tip icon, its frequency, use, and symbolic importance as a containment and capture icon. A few miles away, the Potash panel on Potash Road exhibits split tips in a different but similar context. The Potash panel is located where the river meets the cliff, a good place to trap a herd of animals, bring them down from poison spider above, and then disadvantage them where the river and the cliff meet. Instead of wavy lines, this panel uses crosshatch lines to indicate containment and capture intention. As I mentioned, any linear glyph might be considered for containment and capture. The panel includes the predator track at top center. The ends of the lines that form the corral end in the split tips, like at the bag panel. So it appears there is a definite connection between split tips and linear entrapment designs. The entire process of proximal and inferential interpretation comes together in this image. The appearance of the primary interpretive element, the predator track, reinforces the predatory intent of the entire panel and its design elements. The lines on the first slide in the process, part of this show, acquired a predatory intent primarily through proximal transference from predator tracks, ergo the company you keep. The wavy lines on the bag panel acquired their initial predatory intent through secondary transference by trapping the sheep from across the canyon and reiterating the wavy lines of the bag on that side of the canyon. That photo was enough to associate the wavy bag lines with the split tips, indicating their predatory characteristics and inferring that they bore watching. Ergo, I know a guy who knows a guy. The appearance of the split tips here amplifies the predatory character of the icon on this panel when we assume that these split tips transfer the trapping intent seen on the bag panel. Adding emphasis to this interpretation is the appearance of a variation of the primary interpretive element, the predator track, which began this discussion. The neighboring anthropomorph appears to be active, perhaps running or throwing something. Several similar figures appear nearby. The inferential application of a proximal transference would suggest that he is engaged in some sort of hunting activity, throwing an atlatl perhaps, or driving game into the trap. This is worth some thought, because he is right next to the primary interpretive element. A similar figure appears upper right, where other hunters are attached to or interacting with herds of sheep. The last step in the inferential chain would be secondary inference. Someone showed me how they do it over there. Secondary inference is the imputation of intent with no proximal attachment to the primary interpretive element. For example, initially split tips have no obvious relationship to predator tracks, but through the inferential process, their shared predatory intent becomes plain. Secondary inferential relationships can be applied to other glyphs and tableaus until a parsimonious pattern can no longer be assured. Although it bears no external relationship to the predator track, which began as the primary interpretive symbol in this sequence, the process of transference and inference informs the large figure identifying it as a predatory icon. Based on its bug-like form, a common folk interpretation of this design is centipede. Similar glyphs can be found from Canada to Mexico, California to Colorado. I neither know nor can think of a reason an ancient hunter would use a centipede as a hunting icon. My interpretation, based on an inferential chain, is a deity affiliated with common hunting artifacts such as traps, corrals, gates, fences, nets, etc., tools for which a hunter might wish to receive a blessing from the trap man. The bag glyph, with a sheep trapped inside its wavy lines, provided the split tips with their initial predatory intent through a process of secondary transference. By applying secondary inference from the bag panel onto the polished panel, the split tips continued to carry a predatory intent with the cross-hatched lines. From there, the inferential chain can easily be carried on. The sheep figure is in a startled or distressed posture. It is not clear what the anthropomorph is doing. Assuming, however, that the trap man figure represents a predatory intent, it is fair to apply the same intent to the anthropomorph and assume that there is some sort of confrontation with a sheep. If so, then the entire tableau assumes the conveyance of a single predatory message. Two more aspects of the trap man figure bear mentioning. First are the splayed lines at the figure's bottom, and second is the small head-like protrusion at the top of the cross-hatched line. The splayed lines at the bottom happen often enough to indicate a pattern, but I don't know what it might represent. Perhaps it indicates an anchor or a base for the fence line above, a way for the deity to ground itself into the material world, but that is speculation. Or the immaterial world, I don't know which way it's going. The protrusion is also common, but less enigmatic. To a greater or lesser extent, it resembles a head and gives an anthropocentric character to the icon. If this is an anthropocentric design element, it implies the sentient qualities of an anthropomorph. Notable among them is an ability to communicate between the deity and its human worshippers. This makes perfect sense in the context of hunting magic. The hunter and his hunting demiurge are aware of and informed by each other in a metaphysical context, or what is the sense of the two realms sharing the same place? This variation of the trap man, also on Moab's Potash Road, incorporates the split tips into a single head. The crosshatched lines are chevron-shaped. The icon predominates over a panel that includes game-driving handholders, another version of the trap man, lower left, and a primary interpretive element, a predator track on the right. This variation of the Trap Man is at the end of the Mill Creek Game Drive corridor, southeast of Moab. It looks directly across the canyon at a hanging valley that marks the endpoint of the game drive. The split-tip antennae are fanciful in the extreme. The head is large and emphasizes the anthropocentric character of the glyph, as do the arms extending from the shoulder area. The Trap Man is across the canyon from this hanging valley. During the course of a game drive, the sheep would have been herded down canyon, then up a ramp at the right of this photo. Once in the hanging valley, it would be a simple chore to contain them, as there is no exit of note. The sandy benches at the bottom of this photo are rich in charcoal lenses, fire-cracked rock, and groundstone, all signs of domestic consumption. Upstream to the left, there are over 100 panels and nearly 3,000 glyphs in the previous 2 miles. Downstream, there is one small panel a mile away, then nothing for another 2 miles. End of the line. The San Pedro River flows north out of Mexico. Between these hills here, there is rock art at the location on both sides of that gap, including several Trap Man glyphs. This Trap Man glyph is one of several near the Mexican border along the San Pedro River, east of Sierra Vista, Arizona. It has a variation of the splayed base, and based on its light patina, it is a relatively recent piece of art, say 1,000 years old and possibly of Hohokam or Sinagua origin. This Trap Man glyph is one of many at Long Lake along the edge of the Pleistocene lake basins in southern Oregon. Some of its companion glyphs were buried in the volcanic ash from Mount Mazama's eruption nearly 8,000 years ago. It bears some resemblance to regionally contiguous glyphs at Nevada's Lake Winnemucca, which are reliably dated to 12,000 BC. This suggests that a trapping deity was recognized and honored using similar design elements by hunters in the American West for a very long time over a broad region. April at Long Lake, Oregon. A volcanic dike about 2 miles long and 10 to 15 feet high gathers a large snowdrift during the winter. When the snow melts during the summer, it waters forage at the base of the cliff that the wild animals used when they moved down from the summer range in the nearby high country during the mating season. When it rained in the fall, a sticky clay-bottomed pluvial lake formed to the left, creating ideal conditions for a mire trap. Mud to the left and an unscalable wall on the right. There are thousands of glyphs along this and other similar formations in the area. These glyphs include dozens of what might be construed as Trap Man glyphs. Mire traps were very common ways to end a game drive. Like the previous 3 examples, The placement of this trap man glyph on Moab's Cane Creek Road seems to be geosensitive. The Cane Creek Trap Man glyph, the largest in the area, is placed on a boulder where the canyon's topography goes from very wide with a lot of excellent bighorn habitat around it. Those cliff lines out there are perfect bighorn habitat. But then the topography goes to a very steep and narrow, excellent topography in which to lay a trap using fences, nets, and so forth, the kinds of artifacts for which you would seek a blessing from the trapping deity, Trapman. For those of you familiar with this section of Cane Creek, directly ahead here is the famous climbing area known as the Ice Cream Parlor. The nearby Birthing Rock contains 2 Trapman glyphs, lower left. There are also 3 atlatls on this rock. One is seen here. It lies across the belly of a woman who is giving birth, suggesting a hunter's blessing for her newborn son. You can see the umbilical cord freed up underneath her. This is not the only panel I know where hunting and fertility share space. This suggests that a pattern of proximal transference may exist between hunting and fertility symbols. Why, I don't know. Maybe it's because good hunters make good husbands. In this brief presentation I have shown, I hope, how a single primary interpretation can, through a series of proximal relationships and logical inferences, lead to an ever-widening array of viable interpretations for an array of Moab's Basketmaker rock art. Both the Codicon and Game Drive are rich in further suggestions of this sort. I mention some overtly, hint at others, and assume that many are latent but remain hidden from me. Of note are ideas and opportunities to be found in the linear and geometric sections of the Codicon and corollary discussion in Game Drive. Meanings belonging largely to folklore, maps, springs, mountains, or meaningless but important sounding jargon, rectilinear and curvilinear, for example, may succumb to an assiduous application of a hunting hypothesis. I suggest several ways such a hypothesis might be applied in the Codicon, but it will be a labor-intensive effort and one I will not, to my regret, have time to accomplish. If such hypotheses can be derived, if evaluations can be consistently developed and applied, they may provide the keys to understanding vast amounts of linear rock art along the ancient shorelines of the Pleistocene lakes that once filled the Great Basin. Furthermore, certain common symbols, spirals, quote lizards, and quote snakes, for example, may start to surrender some of their hitherto hidden messages. I make several suggestions as to how this might be accomplished in the Codicon and game drive, but suggestions is all they are. For example, the numbering of linear junctions found along a given linear array may provide value by using a consistent counting regime. To my mind, nothing with the certitude of a primary interpretation has yet been identified in the linear geophysical realm. Therefore, this once again is mere speculation. Geometric realm, that's the word I was looking for. Nonetheless, by using similar techniques in the Codicon, I have derived definitions for over 80 Basketmaker rock art symbols, which can be applied to interpretation of individual glyphs, tableaus, and entire panels using the aforementioned process wherever such symbols and tableaus may appear. I realize that there is much room for testing and argument in this matter, and I welcome it. If there's one thing I'm sure of, it's that I have made a lot of mistakes. In the course of developing and refining the Codicon, I also developed and simultaneously refined a testing tool of my own, rock art in the Mill Creek Game Drive Corridor, an interpretive exercise. Game Drive, as I call it, covers over 1,400 screens, includes over 1,000 pictures, and exclusively uses definitions from the Codicon to explain its premises, to explain and quantify, I should add. Shortly after I posted these documents on my website, moabrockart.org, I realized that singly and together they are too rich and dense to attract the attention of casual or obsessive observers alike when they came to visit the site. So, since I consider the Codicon to be the actual backbone of my work, my most valuable contribution to the study of rock art, I decided to create this slideshow, which, like the other slideshows on the website, is meant to be intellectually accessible while addressing finite fields of interest. Using the logical analytical sequences I have developed for my work in the Codicon, primary interpretation, proximal transference, secondary transference, and secondary inference, I have derived definitions for over 80 Basketmaker rock art symbols, which can be applied to interpretation of individual glyphs, tableaus, and entire panels, not just in Moab, but I believe in many other parts of the region. It's like there's different dialects that you have to handle, but that is part of the work. I've come to think that the sequence I have developed may be applicable to rock art interpretation, not merely for the Southwest's prehistoric past, but for rock art arrays around the world and throughout time, from the giraffes of Niger to the lions of Chauvet. I'll just have to test that out, I guess, eh? The symbols will not be the same, though many will be analogous. The primary interpretive elements will have to be identified, but once that is done, the logical process is fairly straightforward, learnable, and replicable. The only requirements will be nearly infinite amounts of observation and a scrupulously parsimonious regimen of pattern recognition. I hope you enjoyed this show, and that some few of you will take it for what, in the final analysis, it was meant to be. Bait. Come and get it. Thank you for watching this. Rory.